fellow moderator is Barry from Cameroon. We are here to moderate, and today's topic is financing youth-led climate action from COP26 to SP56, youth engagement on green bonds. So due to our limited time, I'll just start from the first question, which I would like to point it out to Olumide. So COP26 was dubbed the Climate Finance COP26. It was set to check whether the international community met the USD 100B target. It did not, but it increased momentum towards the realization of the Paris Agreement, given that green bonds is a fairly complex facing new agenda. Most developing nations are yet
So really sorry for that. I think my coordinator, she has a problem with her network. So we are just going to the first question, which is on since our thematic today is on green bonds. She was trying to ask the first question, which is on the the first ever green bond. The, the first ever green bond was issued by the World Bank in 2007. Later in 2000, government followed. This seems to be largely dominated by the private sector in finance sectors. From your opinion, give also the space for private sectors is opening up. Is there room and potential for green bonds discussion and engagement to be involved further into the grassroots, into the SMEs, especially in developing countries? So I think that the first question goes thus. Do you really think that if the private sector is really participating when it comes to climate into green bonds, can they really participate by encouraging the grassroots sectors to also participate in this domain? So I would like Mr. Olumide Lala to answer this question.
Sorry, Barry Smith. Sorry, allow me to interrupt. I am sorry. Barry is new within this whole process of running the webinar, so I think he will learn. This is sort of a test pilot project for the new incumbent team. So I think the common ideal thing is to welcome everybody. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon from wherever you are, because we know these are global webinar basically, so we're expecting guests from all over the world. So with that, of course, I'd like to sort of set the pace to keep it ongoing, because I think it's the first time for Grace and Barry, so I was trying to basically put them on the deep end, but I think we've had a bit of challenges. So basically what we're going to do basically is just how basically we've been able to highlight it basically on the webinar. It's going to be short, it's going to be very easy going. So I'd like to give this first round of opportunities to all our speakers, from Olomide to Damila to Daniel to every speaker, to basically introduce themselves so that our audience can get to know who you are and what you do and how it relates to green bonds. And basically, from your experience, how does green bond really contribute to this climate change agenda? Because it's not really a common topic. So I would like to set the pace with that. And I'd like to give, of course, Olomide, of course, the floor. Then we can go around that. And then I will welcome back my trainee, my mentees, to basically, as they get to catch along with the program. So Olomide, the floor is yours. And yeah, so introduce yourself. And yeah, we just take the floor.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to you all. Perhaps I will just set the, before I introduce myself, perhaps I will just ask first protocol. If you're not speaking, please put yourself on mute because it's quite distracting, the noise in the background. Olumide Lala is my name. I am the co-founder and the director of Climate Finance Services at Climate Transition Limited, which is a UK registered consultancy firm. Our focus is entirely on galvanizing green finance, be it at the private sector level or public sector level, for African and infrastructure development in Africa. Our main audience, our main clientele ranges from government, and when I say government, I mean all facets of government, be it the ministries of finance, environment, budget and planning, all the way through to regulators, SEC, CMA, central banks, and all the way down to the private sector. Even though you got corporates, typically a lot of our clients are financial institutions, your banks. And I will explain that later, how that connects to the first and second questions that you've asked. But in a nutshell, that is me. And I've spent the last 32 years in financial services, the last 22 years in capital markets, and the last 10 actually, developing financial instruments and products in Africa. Just to final point, you probably know that I have spent in the last 5 years, we've worked on the Green Bonds Market Development Initiative, both in Nigeria and also in Kenya. Over. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Olumide. It's nice to know that we have someone with a very vast experience on the complex topic of green bonds. I will move over to Debjit. I don't know if I pronounce your name properly.
No, that is
introduction.
correct.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So am I audible? Just a mic check first.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm thankful to the moderators for inviting me as a panelist on this discussion on green bonds. I have been working in the sustainable finance space for over 2 years now, and I'm currently employed in Sustainalytics, a Morningstar company. As many of you would know, Sustainalytics provides high quality research, ratings, and ESG data to institutional investors and companies. But more specifically, I'm part of the Sustainalytics corporate solutions team, where we provide independent second-party opinions on corporates and sovereign issuances of green bonds, and like whether the use of proceeds under their frameworks align with the green bond principles of the International Capital Market Association, or ICMA. However, I would just quickly like to point out that being a part of this informative webinar voluntarily, whatever I opine on this evening do not in any way represent my institution and my own personal outlook on green bonds. So yeah, that's about me, and I'm looking forward to an engaging discussion this evening with other esteemed panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Debjit. It's wonderful that we have a blend of diversity. We've moved from Africa back to, of course, I think it should be Asia and India within the region. I'll jump straight over to Daniel, who we've had a chat with previously. So, Daniel, the floor is yours.
Hi, good day, everybody. Can you hear me? My own mic check? Okay, great. So my name is Daniel Fuchs. I am a climate finance analyst for the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. So San Francisco in California, and Public Utilities Commission delivers wastewater services to the city of San Francisco, public power to the city of San Francisco, and clean drinking water to the city as well as to the surrounding area. The water comes from across the state of California through a complex network of pipes, which requires a lot of infrastructure. And so I work on the capital finance team to issue green bonds. We actually use Sustainalytics to provide second party opinions. And so most of my experience over the past 2 years has been all of my experience has been in California infrastructure finance and using green bonds and working with other issuers, bond issuers in the state to develop the green bond program. So I'm excited to speak more about that in the United States, but also how it applies across the world. And like Debjit, I should just say I'm also here on a voluntary basis, speaking from my personal opinion and not representing the organization.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for that insight. I'm looking forward to. Looks like we have a very wide, broad a team of panelists looking at different sectors within the green bonds, which is looking like a very huge and complex agenda even before we begin these discussions. I'd give the floor over to Damilola. I don't know if they're able to turn on the mic, if that's possible. I'm trying to get a hold of Darren. Damilola, I don't know if Damilola is able to. Yes.
Yeah. Hi everyone. So I'm just turning on my camera briefly. So Darren is actually able to join. He's listening to us, but I understand he can't see. He can't turn on his video basically. So he's apologize for that, but he's actually listening to us. So I'm Damilola Ilowo. I'm the head of program for Climate Transition Limited. So I'm also working with Mr. Lala and Darren, and then I'm sure at the end of this session we'll have a very good would pick a lot of things up. And then if there are any questions, please let's put them open, and we can get all our queries clarified as well. So thanks everyone. I would allow you drive as well.
Thank you for that. Given that in the interest of time, I know speakers also have other things, I think we'll quickly jump over the session. Since I'm having new trainees, I think I will take the first set of the questions so that they get to be comfortable with, of course, our speakers and also this whole process, so that I show them basically how we sort of drive this sort of discussion. So I'll just quickly jump over to the first question. So we know that the first ever green bond was issued by the World Bank and EIB in 2007, according to a bit of research we did. Later, large corporations came into basically this particular agenda, and later, of course, we had the local governments basically followed into this issue of green bonds. We were having the discussion with Daniel, I think yesterday, about local government engagement. This seems to be largely dominated by the private sector in the financial sector, basically. From your opinion, from your opinion, and also given that the space, we know that the climate change space is slowly opening up for basically this cohort of people, basically the private sector, basically. Is there room or potential for green bonds discussions to be mainstreamed further to possibly the SMEs? Because we know that SMEs is something that is coming up, and basically, especially for the developing countries. And if you could give us the overview of basically the players within issues of green bonds, because we've seen World Bank, and then we've seen the large corporations, and then of course we've seen the local governments. So who else basically engages on issues of green bonds? And do you think there's room for SMEs, basically potential in the future, to basically engage within the green bond sector? So I would start with Daniel and see what he thinks about that, then hand over to Olomide, then we could see how we juggle around that.
Yeah, and I'll try to stay brief. So, in our role for issuing green bonds, essentially how it works with us is, and I should mention, we are a public sector, so we are a government agency, and so in that capacity, we provide, because we provide water and we operate in California. California has a number of environmental laws produced at the local government level that requires our infrastructure to meet certain environmental, social, or governance objectives. And as a result of that, we are usually qualified for our projects are usually qualified to be green bonds. And it's like a regular bond, which is a loan. But it's a commitment to use that loan and those proceeds on environmentally beneficial projects. And we follow the green bond principles around standards and practices to ensure that those green bond funds are used as we've told them. And so as a result of that, we report on a regular basis. Every year we issue voluntary annual reports that report on the spending on those bonds, on those projects. So we make it very clear to our external verifiers, as well as our investors and members of the public, exactly how those funds are used. And so I do that quick overview because I think it helps show that, or like it clarifies that it's actually what green bonds are is really a commitment to reporting and transparency. And I think, but otherwise they're just like any other loan that you could use. So at least that's how we've been treating them. And so that from that measure, I think there's a lot of room for growth, a lot of areas for any type of entity to engage in that idea. Whether they're green bonds might not apply to you. We talked yesterday about the idea of like individuals don't necessarily issue green bonds. Usually it's corporates or governments do that. But the idea of consistently reporting on how your money is being used for environmental benefits and communicating that in a way that has that is trustworthy is a big commitment for us. So I'll pause there. I don't want to take up too much more of the space.
Thank you, Daniel, for that. I'd like to skip over to Lobide to see, because Daniel, I think, is based in the US. Let's skip over to Africa, where I think SMEs is a very strong component, basically, of the economy. So I'd like to hear Olobide's take, basically, on could you possibly foresee the engagement of other players apart from the existing ones within the green bonds engagement, with, of course, looking at the other players in terms of maybe the SMEs, basically, within, of course, the African continent that you have vast experience in. So, Lomide, the floor is yours.
Right. So just to give some clarification, right? Before I set up my own company, I used to work for Climate Bonds Initiative, which is an international company. I'm actually based in London, and we've done a lot of work across the globe. However, we've decided to focus on Africa for a number of good reasons, and that's because, as you know, the impact of climate change is largely felt more so in Africa than anywhere else. Having said that, the emissions are probably more from the industrial or more developed countries. Now, the question you've asked has a number of things in there. So if you think about it, the very first talked about the fact that the green bonds have been issued by large entities, and then you then pivot into how that affects the discussions amongst the SMEs. Now, just to give, and I think Daniel tried to allude to this, and I understand we have a varied degree of understanding of what green bonds are. First things first, a green bond is no different to a normal bond in the way it's structured. And what's a bond? A bond basically is a large debt issued and often takes a tradable instrument, often issued by large corporates, governments, and subnationals. The reason why that is, and it's very important to note this, is the cost of issuing a bond is quite high. So you don't get small to medium companies going around issuing bonds. They probably take out some sort of debt, yeah, but you have to be of a certain size to be able to take up a bond, because a bond below a certain price, when you below a certain value, when you actually talk about the cost of issuing that bonds, it might become impractical or inefficient way of using money for a small to medium entity. Having said that, Daniel did make reference to disclosure. So in terms of the discussion, which is, for green bonds discussions and engagements may involve further into the grassroots, certainly the SMEs need to be part of this conversation, because the data set and the reporting requirements that the issue of a bond would require, be it a financial institution such as a bank, will typically come from those that they've lent money to, from what we call the Scope 3 reporting requirements. So, the SMEs themselves who will benefit from the issuance of this bond, who've used this money to implement and finance green assets. And by that, the difference between a normal bond and a green bond is simply what you use the money for. And I think Dejit, who works for sustainability, will speak to that in a second. And Daniel did allude to that as well. So the difference is what you use the money for. Now, if you think about that, there's certain criteria that you've got to follow through to establish the fact that you're going to use the money for something. Yeah. Now, you've got to report against that. So the discussion in terms of where the SMEs come in is about capacity building. It's a new, as you said, it's actually largely new, but certainly people need to understand what it is they're reporting against and what they're using the money for. And also, there are other structures in terms of how you select and evaluate projects. That's important. There's what we call the 4 pillars, if you will, which speaks to the identification, the criteria for identification of projects, the evaluation and selection process, the management of funds, how this money is managed and allocated, and finally, how we report against the use of proceeds, which is what the International Capital Markets Association, to which Dijet referred to earlier. But also, what's more important now is obviously impact reporting, and that speaks to also environmental as well as climate, and in some cases social reporting requirements, depending on whether you're issuing what is a climatic bond or a green bond, or more importantly, a sustainability bond or a social bond. So it's a very massive space, which we cannot digest in 1 hour. What I will say is this: the more information that people understand, and that's all of us generally, whether you're the issuer of a bond, whether you're an investor into a bond, where you're just Joe Blogs on the streets managing various projects or schools or whatever, or consultants, the more information and more knowledge that we all have about how this thing works, it's a lot easier for us to operate. Now, finally, it's also important to understand the difference, because one of the questions makes reference to adaptation and mitigation. It's also important to know the difference about how this is applied in developed markets and how it's applied in developing markets, and the implications in terms of some of the challenges, which refers to some of data sets that we don't have and all of that stuff, which, you know, my man from sustainability will pick up in a second and tell you some of the challenges he has when it comes to reporting and providing not certification, second party opinions on use of proceeds. So I'll stop at that point. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Very insightful. I'm getting more curious. I think I'm learning personally on my own personal capacities being enhanced on green bonds, and the fact that how it is applied in developed and developing markets. That's a very interesting agenda that we would, of course, indulge in. Maybe not in this session, but something I would personally want to indulge in the next coming session. So I will quickly jump over to Debjit, and yeah, let him give us his perspective on this particular agenda.
Sure. So I agree with what Alumide hinted at, and rightly so. There is huge potential for green bonds to evolve at the grassroots level, especially among SMEs and in developing nations. And what I would like to add here is that the data also rightly suggests so. Issuances of green bonds are important, as it is kind of the main funding source for the sustainable development goals. But yes, the green bond is an emerging concept in developing nations, and the corporates and governments in such areas might not always show the expertise. To add to the troubles, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused a bit of disruption to the development of green bonds around the world, especially in developing nations. Moreover, as Daniel also mentioned, that green SMEs in developing countries have been growing steadily. But what I can kind of add to that argument is that some of the more popular areas in which small businesses have been historically successful are renewable energy, then green buildings, clean transportation like hybrid cars, waste collection, and in recycling. So in recent decades, entrepreneurship in developing world has been increasing at a steady pace, which should be channeled towards converting environmental constraints into business opportunities. Therefore, policy interventions for supporting green SMEs in developing countries are urgently required. And it could be in the form of knowledge sharing, raising environmental awareness, then enhancing financial support, or something improving market access through green taxation. So that's my stand on it. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Very insightful. I don't know if Barry is able to jump to his in now. Before we go to Barry, I think we might get some bit of insight from Damilola so that he gives us also his perspective. Sorry, I almost forgot about you. So yeah, Damilola.
Okay, thanks everyone, and Mr. Lala, thanks for that very insightful and good information as well. What I would mention is First and foremost, bonds were principally written for developed markets, and the most important challenges, one of the most important challenge that we face today is regarding data, because it's important and necessary to keep to record and to record the number of projects that go. So what I would say as well is we cannot isolate any party. So in implementing a green bond, it's important to have the financial institution, the role of the finance. There's a role for the banks, the role for the guarantor, as well as the role for the DFI. So everyone has a part to play, and it's important for everyone to be carried along as well. So that's what I will have for now. Basically.
Thank you for that. That was a very insightful fast-on introduction. I don't know if Barry is able to turn on his camera. I don't know if Barry is available. Barry? Oh, yes. You can take the next set of questions. I think he'll just learn as we go. Yes. So, Barry?
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Damir Lola, for the question you answered, and thank you, Mr. Olamith, as well as Daniel and David. This is really impressive getting this type of response from analysts like you people. Climate inspiration is to many people out there in the world. So the next question goes thus: we know COP26 was dubbed the Climate Finance COP, as it was said to check whether the international community met the 100 billion US dollar target. It did not, but it increased momentum towards the realization of the Paris Peace Agreement, that was green bonds. Is it fairly complex? Fairly new agenda, most complex, fairly now agenda most developing nations are yet to fully understand and endorse in the concept. In your opinion, do you think discussions at the COP26 advance engagement in green bonds? If so, how? So, in order to answer this question, we are going to hear the first response from Mr. Daniel. Daniel, please. Do you think, do you really think, in your own opinion, discussions at COP26 advancement engage on green bonds? If you think so, and then give us how. What are the various steps and momentum that were adapted during this COP26 to fully apply these green bonds?
Yeah, well, in full disclosure, I did not attend COP26. I was so I don't know the level of discussion around green bonds. What I have just observed globally is a major increase in discussions in green bonds, even just in the short time that I've been in this role. And I think it stems from more and more demand from European investors specifically, but all over the world, investors are asking for greater transparency around projects, how those projects contribute to environmental goals. There's the European taxonomy of investments that also requires certain disclosure standards. So I would say, without knowing the specifics of COP26, I do think that there is a global advancing of green bond discussions. But I'll leave the floor to others who might be more familiar with what was discussed.
Okay, thank you very much. We know COP26 was a very important COP to many who participated, and was really, there are tangible reasons that we are made in addressing the climate crisis we are facing. So we know the developing nations are trying to really engage in this concept of green bonds, but there are many nations back in developing countries that don't yet understand this concept. With Damela, do you think if developing countries get to understand beyond target uh, given by the World Bank to this? Damilola, I think. Hello.
You broke off a bit, so you could maybe rephrase and repeat the question so that Dabilola could hear it, because I think at some point you broke off. I think network issues.
Okay, then I can repose the question. I can give the question to Mr. Olamide, who is the co-founder of who is the co-founder and director of Climate Finance Climate Transition Limited. So I asked, developing countries are not yet versed and engaged under this domain of green bonds. What methods can be used so as to impose this green bond concept into developing countries? What can they really do for people to really engage themselves to this idea of green bonds in developing countries?
Well, you asked for an opinion, so I'll give you my opinion. Incidentally, I was actually at COP26. And yes, it's increased the conversation around green. There's pretty been more issuance in the developed markets. As you know, as at the time we went to COP26, green bonds globally had exceeded $1 trillion. It's moved pretty fast in the last 3 months. We've probably mixed more green and sustainability as well. So there's been a sort of a blur in the count of the issuance. Have we had more geared towards additionality as opposed to refinancing? It's a different conversation. However, my focus, as I said, rather than look at the globe, I'm a bit more biased. So I try to focus on how all of this conversation has enhanced the issuance of green bonds in Africa, and how has that financed projects on the continent. Well, the numbers don't lie and the data speaks for itself. And I'm sure my man from Sustainalytics will agree with me. We haven't really had that much momentum in new issuance on the continent. I forget. It says GYCFA. I forget your name, madam. Perhaps you can repeat your name. My Kenyan sister. We've been talking to the government of Kenya for the last 4 years. I mean, they've been wanting to issue a green bond since 2017, and it still hasn't happened yet. Cameroon and is another one who's increased their momentum in terms of the discussions around green since COP26. The same is going on in Cote d'Ivoire around the West, and I know that conversations are going on around the southern part of the continent. But the long story short is, what's missing and what can we do to increase this conversation? It's capacity building. The level of understanding of what is required to actually issue a green bond. And by the way, when we say issue a green bond, if you recall, I said issuing a bond, be it green, blue, it's no different. It's a bond. What we're effectively doing, and my man from Sustainalytics will agree with me here, is that you're labeling a bond green. In order to do that, you've actually got to understand what the criteria is to be able to do that. You know, what makes a bond, what makes a project green? What are criteria you need to overcome to ensure or adhere to, whether it's via the guidelines to have a second party opinion, or certification under the green bond standard, or even aligning with the Euro taxonomy? What are the criteria? And there are processes, by the way, you have to go through in terms of selection and evaluation. But you know, the first thing is, how do you identify it from a user process perspective? That's number one. But more important, that's important because you've got to be reporting against it. So how do you issue something if you don't even understand what it is? So I guess, in my opinion, for all the noise that we made at COP26, and by God, we will make even more noise come COP27 in Egypt. The fact is, unless we understand what it is we're trying to do, we're just banging our heads against the wall. So for every single country, the most important thing to do, and by the way, we spent 3 years building a green bonds market in Kenya. Why were we not as successful? We ended up issuing the Acorn green bond, which was a private sector one. As I said earlier on, the government has been talking about issuing one for the last 4 years. Well, I say 4 years, since 2017 actually. So that's what, I don't know, 5 years. The fact is, even if you look at the banking sector, the interest rate cap that we had for about 2 or 3 years in Kenya did not help the situation, because then the banks did not come to market. So, there's certain fundamentals that affects the bond market itself, which needs to be addressed even before you start to indicate whether you can issue a green bond or not. So, look, and that's why I said to you, when you're talking about green bonds in the developed market and you're talking about green bonds in the developing markets, two different conversations, because these things, some of the obstacles and challenges that you face in the developing markets, you don't see that in developed markets because it's just not there. We can talk and talk forever and a day. This is an area which I'm quite passionate about. So I will yield the floor to somebody else to add some more color to what we're saying. Thank you.
Yes, before the bit takes off the flight, I think conversation is getting very interesting. I think I have been put on the limelight for Kenya and green bonds. I'd actually like to report that in 2019, 2018, Kenya issued its first sovereign green bonds. This was done by the National Treasury and Planning. I have to confirm this with you, and it was supposed to build green hostels. We can debate about it, but I actually have connections to the National
Madam,
Treasury. Yes,
madam, let me
yes.
interject. In 2018, Acorn Holdings issued the first green bonds in East Africa. That was Acorn's Holdings, not the government. Yeah. And by the way, I was at the London Stock Exchange with the president. Yeah. 6 months later, as in Mr. President Kenyatta, when he was actually launched. So I was part of this program. Yeah. I built the program. The government is yet to launch a green bond. They're yet to do it. The only bond you have in the market is by Acorn Holdings. They've since done a second issuance, but that's the only one you have in Kenya. You can take that to the bank.
Okay.
Guaranteed.
I will report back. Thank you. I can give the floor to Jublich so that to add, of course, juice to this particular. So sorry, I interjected Barry's session to add to continue with this conversation, Jublich.
Yeah, sure. So what I would like to point out is that, like, if you look at the commitments made at the COP26, so I mean, there is a significant deviation from the actual wordings that were written in the report and the actual direction that the COP26 aimed at for the financial sector specifically. So what I want to mean is that if you kind of like try searching the keyword green bonds in any of the COP26 report, I doubt that whether it would pop up. But yeah, in terms of the attempt, I would say that they did try to make a focus on the sustainable investments, and the financial sector was a focus at the summit. They tried to do it through the form of some alliance where we saw like bankers, insurers, and investors committing to make climate change priority from the COP26. And the name of the alliance was actually Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. So the alliance agreed to kind of like, devote 130 trillion in private capital funding, which is around 40% of the world's financial assets, committing to hit net zero by 2050. What was kind of like, glorious about it on paper was that its members represented nearly 450 financial institutions from 45 countries who pledged to report every year on their lending practices, such as disclosing the carbon emissions and then like where their capital is going, etc. But as of today, some, like, not some, but many remain skeptical on the progresses actually achieved. But yes, on paper, to answer the question simply, the COP26 did try to, like, advance engagement on financial instruments, but not specifically green bonds. So yeah, that would be my take. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I don't know if Damilola would have something to contribute to the discussions before I hand over back to Barry. Barry, sorry, I stole your station.
So can I add one more thing, please?
Yes.
So in terms of the discussions at COP26, as Digit has just reminded me, if you do a Google search, you wouldn't find the word green bonds, and it's for good reasons. Actually, COP26 was more or less about aligning with the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions for each country. Green bonds is just one of the tools that we use to achieve that. So, the COP26 was more about the commitments of each country to their contribution to reducing the rising temperature. As you know, we are trying to keep the temperature below 1.5. Yeah. So it's all about the nationally determined contributions. Green bonds, like other financial other tools, just green bonds is just one of those tools that we use to finance projects that can make that contribution. So just to clarify that, please. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Damilola. Oh, Barry, let me hand over to you to use your session. Sorry, I stole it. Barry?
Okay, thank you very much for all your contributions. We know it is not really easy down here trying to grab and provide questions to such a very big topic, and we know millions of people are following us and trying to get to one or two things from your expertise. So we are going to go to the next question, which is talking also also on the same topic about green bonds, but it goes does the international community did not meet the 100 billion US dollar target. Only 80% was realized. In your expert opinion, do you think increased uptake of green bonds could have brought the global community closer to meeting the target of the 100 billion US dollar, US dollar, US dollar? Do you think, with great strategy, that increased uptake of green bonds could contribute towards future goals such as post 2025 goal, new collective quantified goal on climate finance? So, like we noticed that the 100 billion US dollar target was not met. Only 80% of that was met. So they're asking you, due to your expert opinion, do you think increased uptake of green bonds could have brought the global community closer to meeting the target of the 100 billion US dollar, uh, the 100 billion US dollar? So I think I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Lala to clarify us on what we had to do in order to achieve this idea.
Um, if I may say, actually, I think your question, maybe if I can your question needs refining. Yeah. So, because I think it gives the impression that you're saying that we did not issue $100 billion in 2020, whatever, 2021 or something, which is not the case. I think what we're trying to do here, the $100 billion to which they make reference here, is that there's a commitment that the global world will provide $100 billion generally to providing financing towards green and sustainable projects. Not necessarily that we will raise 100 billion in green bonds, if that makes any sense, because we exceeded $100 billion in issuance in 2021 anyway.
I think how the question meant to come out was that we know that we're supposed to mobilize 100 billion according to the Paris Agreement by 2020. That was the goal, and we've seen that there are different forms of climate finance. I think this is tied to the next level of question, and green bonds is sort of a loan, and we know that climate finance is a mixture of loans and debts, and that, do you think that given that, of course, we've seen that mobilization of issues of climate finance reached around $80 billion, do you think if there was more uptake from capacity building, like we've explained, more uptake on green bonds, we would come closer to that target? And do you think that if people, like you said, indulge more on that, maybe more corporations could get into that particular agenda? Do you think it will get us closer? It can get us closer to future goals, such as, of course, the post 2025 goal that is proposed and other climate finance goals. Know that green bonds is supposed to be issued for 100 billion. This is reference to the global commitment. Do you think it could contribute to the global commitment? I think that is how the question meant to come out. Yes.
Okay, I think the problems. To be honest with you, I think the problems you have, yeah, is yet again going back to capacity building. And I'll tell you why. If there's a lack of understanding of what is green, then the problem is creating the link between eligible projects, yeah, and the taxonomy becomes an issue. Because if I don't even know what I'm looking for and I don't understand the criteria, how do I go looking for projects that meets the criteria for which we can then issue green bonds against? You see what I mean? So it's not just green bonds, it's just green generally, whether it's sustainability, social, the data to support the so you have and Dajit is probably best to speak to this. So Dajit basically is invited to come and provide a second party opinion to somebody to Mr. Lala, who is Lala PLC. I'm trying to issue a bond, yeah. So I will invite Dajit to come and give me a second party opinion on the projects I'm trying to finance, to which I'm going to raise money. If I don't even understand the criteria that Dajit is looking for, how do I even get enough projects to attract money for it to be financed? Because when Dajit comes, he will say, no, this doesn't meet it, this doesn't meet it, this doesn't meet it. And where I'm thinking I had a project which is worth $50 billion, then he's going to tell me I've only got $10 billion. So if it's going to cost me too much money to even raise $10 billion, why bother? So the issue here is about eligibility to the taxonomy out there and finding the data to back that up. So you have to align that data with what the verifier is looking to come and verify, because the third-party verification, I can't say I've got a green bond until Dajio tells me that it meets the guidelines or the criteria for me to go and issue and then go to market to raise the money. So aligning that, getting the data to align the projects with the taxonomy is very important. The problem is we don't have enough knowledge or understanding of what that is. It's not general enough. So we need more capacity building money to preach the gospel, if I can use the phrase. Yeah. Think about it from a religious perspective. I've got to go out there, not just tell people about Islam or Christianity or whatever, Shintoism or Judaism. I've got to make them understand what it means. Yeah. So what does it mean to be green? What does the projects have to meet to be green? That is imperative, because if I don't do that, Dalgit will tell me, so I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, it will tell me that my project is not green, and then I cannot finance it. So that's the main issue. That's why we're not growing. And that's the problem we're having in Africa, as opposed to the developed market. And it's not because we're dim or stupid. It's because in the developed world, you already have processes and tools and technology that are set up to gather this data ab initio. Yeah. So you just get the data anyway. Over here, we're still struggling to even understand, let alone build the processes. So we don't even know what the data we're looking for, how to mine the data, how to understand, or even present the data in a decision useful manner. Let Daljit come in on this one.
Yes,
Please.
yes, I actually agree. Yes.
Sure. I mean, like, I completely agree with Mr. Lala. And it's kind of like that, how to put it? Like, if you look at the business model in kind of like any developing nation on green bonds, you would see that historically developing nations, they have needed some form or the other assistance from their respective governments at one point of time to kind of like grow in a particular strategy, and which kind of like might not have been the best. So what I'm trying to emphasize over here is that if the developing nations are kind of like like suddenly opened to the market forces of demand and supply, then chances are that they might not kind of like, given the correct skeleton structure, they might not be able to cope up with that in the green bond market, which is more resilient for the developed nations in Europe, Americas, and elsewhere. So just to kind of uh, like repeat what was kind of like mentioned earlier in this session before, that policy interventions for supporting green SMEs in developing nations are required to some extent. So like strategies such as like knowledge sharing or raising environmental awareness do in fact help the issuances of green bonds to increase in developing nations. Also enhancing financial support through say microcredit systems or cooperatives, and improving market access through green taxation could be other ways to contribute towards the future goals of issuing more green bonds in developing nations. But yes, currently we do need a significant amount of help from respective governments in developing nations, uh, until and unless our understanding of collecting data from the market is, like, fully aligned with taxonomy. So therein what we find the disparities, while providing an SPO for a for a EMEA client, say for example from Europe, and an APAC client from the Asia Pacific region. Yeah.
Could I add just one quick thing? Because I think there's
Please do, Daniel.
Yeah, there's a key, because I'm in the United States, and we do have a lot of established systems. We have a lot of data, but a lot of the ways that we issue bonds, bonds in the United States have been here for more than 100 years, and so well before green bonds. And so we actually have a whole different set of problems of changing our ways that we report and disclose and how we track spending and all these different. That's basically what I do, is try to go back in time and try to make it clear exactly how we're spending that is aligning to green projects. Where I think the opportunity, and I'm not an expert in this, so I definitely defer to the experts, but what I find myself wishing for is the opportunity to work with governments in the establishment of these green bond programs, to provide clear, like to embed into the practice exactly how projects are evaluated and selected, and to use those taxonomies, use groups like Sustainalytics or second party opinion providers to help us develop these systems in a way that will ensure that there's green, that all projects are green financed, and support the ultimate goal of limiting both carbon emissions and building resiliency to the felt effects of climate change. So there is, from my perspective, I think there's a lot of opportunity. In the United States, we have to make all different types of cases in support of green bonds, because it's just a totally different field.
Thank you for that, Daniel. I think that's very great insight. Of course, looking at the difference between developed and developing nations, there's Africa, Asia, and basically a range of perspectives. I don't know if Damilola would like to add something within this particular discussion.
Okay. The network seems a bit bad on my hand, but I hope everyone can hear me. Mr. Olumide Lala has actually said a lot of things I would have loved to say. However, I would need to add that when a green bond is being issued, or before a green bond is being issued, it is important to have a large pipeline of projects that align with the bond. So it's better to have a larger pipeline of projects than even the funds being being issued for the bond. So what I mean is, it's good to have, because in the long term, 3, 5, 7 years from now, it would be good to have a pipeline, different pipelines of projects that align to that, that align with the qualities or with the expectations of that bond, so that you don't get short along the line. Because if one Jude, there would be dependencies in terms of meeting the expectations of the bond. So just highlighting, the pipeline should be bigger and larger than the funds being issued for the bond. That's what I will have basically.
Thank you, Damilola. Barry, take us through the next round of questions.
Okay, once more, thank you again for all your contributions. We know this is not really easy, and we are making great progress when it comes to the domain of green bonds and how we can really implement this between the developed and the developing countries. So, our next question, we are going to talk on this. The question goes thus: given green bonds is a form of loan rather than a grant for developing nations are advocating for more grants than loans to support drive the green bonds agenda. Climate action and sustainable development. In your expert opinion, what barriers and opportunities will you foresee for green bonds as a form of loan with a green growth discussion as well as the climate action agenda? So the question is trying to make us know that people are seeing this green bond as a loan rather than a grant. So that opportunities opportunities would you prefer for green bonds as a form of loan with the green growth discussion as well as in the climate action agenda? So, like trying to understand the question, they're trying to make you that if these green bonds are going to be a form of a loan, which means there is something that we need to pay back. But if we are trying to divert into a world that is more of sustainable development, I think that this green bond should instead be a grant which is trying to lead us through to achieve certain goals and help achieve these sustainable development goals that the United Nations put forward. So, in your own opinion, do you think that there are opportunities or there are certain barriers that are making us not to achieve these green bonds as a form of grant? So, I'll give the floor to Mr. Devjit to really explain to us what he thinks about.
Sure, thank you. So I think that investors mostly seek liquidity, and one of the largest barriers when investing in green bonds could be a lack of liquidity. Being a small market, like entering and exiting positions is not easy, as more popular investments. And another barrier could be the lack of a clear definition for a green bond in developing nations. Investors simply might not exactly know where their money is going, meaning that it could be potentially used for the wrong reasons. And finally, as Mr. Lala previously said, lack of sufficient research available to make an educated investment decision. But looking in terms of opportunities, I would say that currently going green is a popular trend now, and one that looks to continue as long as interest rate grows and new investors are given, like environmentally conscious investment options within their portfolios. If you look at some of the data and research papers, then the World Economic Forum suggests that nearly equal to 700 billion per year needs to be invested in clean energy, transportation, and green forestry. While another agency called the International Energy Agency recommends an investment of around 1 trillion per year towards a low carbon economy by 2035. So yes, I believe that governments around the world are likely to present favorable regulations, which will in turn help many projects go green.
Thank you for that. We can have opinions from Olomide and then Daniel, and then Damilal, of course.
Thanks, Wes. I think first things first, perhaps I should say that we're comparing oranges with apples. You need to understand a bond is not a grant. You're talking about two different things. A grant is money that is given to you to go and do stuff, and potentially could be refundable or non-refundable. A bond is what you might, if I might call it, how do I explain it? A bond is actually a debt instrument, so it is a loan. It's just that it's a tradable loan. So rather than a loan between bilaterals, you and I, it's a debt that is tradable on the market and can be easily transferred and invested in. So two different things. Now, in terms of the question, Africa is asking for grants as opposed to loans or whatever. Look, the part of the conversation around the Paris agenda is that the developed markets or developed nations who potentially or similarly have developed their markets and the economies off the back of polluting the world to the detriment of everybody else. If you want to stop or preclude everybody else from doing the same thing that you've done, then you're obligated to put some money on the table to help other nations do things much better. And that's where that quote unquote large sums of money being put aside for grant is coming from. Now, the question is, you can get given a grant, but if you don't understand what you're using it for, you're going to misuse it. So yet again, education is important. We've got to go back to why we need the money in the first place. And part of the grant is put towards capacity building, for instance, knowledge sharing. Part of the grant could be put towards, if you had a project, for instance, part of the grant could be used to use as not necessarily a guarantee per se, but you could blend the finance by using either grant to buy some of the equipment where the project proponent does not have enough equity. You can use grants, as I said, to enhance the project by providing consultancy services that the project owner might not ordinarily have access to finance. You potentially could use some of that as an anchor investment, if you will, to reduce the risk, to de-risk the project. But let's not confuse that with the bond element or the debt element of the project. So a project has three main phases. The construction phase, where obviously you come together, you actually put all of this stuff together, you construct stuff. And then of course, the area where you've now made it is beginning to make a bit of money. You want to extend it a bit, and you want to go and borrow money to make it more. And then when you become operational, then obviously you want to get more investment into it. Typically, bonds are used to refinance positions. So you'll have already borrowed money at a higher rate, because at that point your project is more risky. You can then refinance your position using green. Now, bonds rather, which is what Daniel was talking about. Bonds have been around forever. I mean, the bond market is over $100 trillion globally. Now, where green comes into it is that you can then look at your projects that you financed and say, I want to refinance my projects. Yeah. Are there green elements to it? Do they meet green criteria? Can I use green finance to finance this and get a better cost of financing? So by so doing, because my project is now less risky, because my projects meet a lot of environmental or climate criteria, I appeal to a wider spectrum of investors, of which there are impact investors and green investors, who are willing to offer me money at slightly lower rate than a commercial bank, for instance. So that's where the connection to the green is and the grants. But let's not confuse either. It's very important that we understand this, please. So where Africa is asking for grants is because they want to use it to de-risk certain projects to enable investors, global investors, who are looking for green opportunity to come in, be they patient money from pension funds or HNIs or whatever. Yeah. So we can't solve this problem in 1 hour. Look, like I said to you, I spent 3 years in Kenya alone, just Kenya, doing development, and yet we still are struggling to bring issuance. So it's a long conversation. Even the banks, the biggest advocate for green issuance in Kenya is Dr. Patrick Njoroge, your central bank governor. Yeah, he's the patron of the Green Bonds development program. But even with that, we're still struggling. The Kenya Banking Association is part of this. We're still struggling to bring new issuance. So persuade the government to issue something, yeah, since you are well connected.
Thank you for that. I think I will pass that message along immediately. I'd give the floor to Daniel so that we don't get into Kenyan Green Bonds agenda at this point. Daniel, your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, everything that has been said is I just want to second that it is key to understand how your financing works. Because a bond is a loan, and like any loan, you have to pay it back with interest. And that's basically the structure of what you are doing with a bond. Whereas a grant is just money delivered to you to deliver on a certain outcome that you've committed to in the grant. And thus you do not there is no payback. I will say that there are bonds, and what we do here, we sometimes create grants from the bonds that we've issued. So someone has lent us money, and we've in turn taken that money and given a grant to deliver an environmental outcome. we still have to pay back that loan, and we have to finance the payback of that loan, but it won't be from issuing that grant. And I say that because that might be helpful on a supranational level, entities like World Bank or IFC, who do issue gigantic green bonds, and they are regularly in the market. And part of those might include grant programs that can be used to either build capacity, like what was said earlier around disclosure, or to environmental or social outcomes already. But the key, so that is key to understand the financing element. But the general philosophy is still there, which is no matter what you're financing, when you are using the term green or social or sustainability, it is a commitment to ensuring that those funds are to deliver those outcomes. And so I do want to make that point clear. It's important to understand these different financing tools, but sometimes the financing tools and the different ways overcloud our ultimate outcome, which is lower carbon emissions, reduce, hitting our temperature goals, building resiliency for the things that we know, the impacts of climate change that are out there. And that's just as true in the United States, where we have established infrastructure that's under threat of this climate change, as it is, I'm sure, on the continent. So I apologize. I have another conflict I do have to jump to, but it was a pleasure meeting everyone and engaging on the panelists, and hopefully the conversation continues. Great, and have a great rest of your day, night, weekend.
Thank you, Daniel. It's unfortunate you have to leave, but we understand. I think we're way past the hour, but you also sort of almost answered all the questions and you are coming towards the end. So before I give the floor back to my colleague Grace, who will be joining us, I would like to ask Damilola to give his insight on the ongoing discussions.
Yeah, what I would just say is when Mr. Olumide Lala was differentiating between the grants and the loan, a lot of times grants also constitutes part of the equity contribution for project developers. So what that means basically is that before the bank, that's a commercial bank, would issue a loan to you, the bank wants to see that you've also brought in something to the table and then you have a skin in the game. So in most cases, it's usually 30-70%. And what that means is 30% equity contribution, 70% of what the bank gives you as a loan, or 20% equity contribution, and then 80% what the bank gives you as a loan. So most times, grants can also constitute the equity contribution, which could either be in terms of cash or assets. So what the bank wants to know is that you have something in stock that exists in your company before they issue the rest of the loan to you. So that's another way of differentiating between the grant and the loan. Grant is usually way lesser than the loan, but then it's always important that a company or a green company has some form of equity contribution that can either come as a grant, either in cash or in assets. So that's what I would also have to what Mr. Lala said as well.
Okay, thank you for that. I think we've answered most of the discussions. I think my colleague is having so much of the technical issues. Okay, I think we've looked at most of the question. I just wanted to ask a quick question, given that we know that bond is sort of a loan, sort of a loan, and we've seen that from basically the general non-finance expert experience, a loan should be able to bring back returns and possibly be able to pay back. So when you look at the landscape of climate finance by CPI, that is 93% of climate finance resources in 2018-2019 went to mitigation rather than adaptation. This is majorly attributed to the fact that mitigation usually is more attractive to, of course, the donors than adaptation, basically because of that aspect of return on investment. Do you think that green bonds aligns more with basically mitigation issues? And do you think there is room for green bonds to contribute towards the adaptation agenda, given that it's a sort of a loan, and a loan usually has direct sort of, you need to pay back the loan or yeah, basically. So what do you think about it? I don't know, start with Debjit, because I think I've seen him nodding, so I'll start with him, and then Olomide, then Damilola.
Yeah, sure. So, like correctly pointed out, While green bonds seem to align more with climate mitigation measures from an investor perspective, however, there are in fact possibilities where green bonds could possibly contribute towards adaptation as well. I would like to highlight an organization called the Global Center on Adaptation, or GCA, which is an international organization in Netherlands working towards action and support for adaptation solutions. And in fact, they have a paper named Green Bonds for Climate Resilience, which uses the term as a shorthand for, a green bond in which some portion or like sometimes all of it is allocated to investments that support climate adaptation. The main point, however, to note here is that a green bond for climate resilience, as they say, enjoys the same benefits as a conventional green bond, that is, focus on low carbon investments. But it also comes with a host of benefits, such as like providing issuers access to low cost capital, then broadening of the investor base, if I may say. It is also well suited to large scale projects that require capital investments ahead of revenues, and it brings visibility and recognition to resilience features within the bonds. And finally, I would like to say that green bonds that have climate adaptation features also create a positive impact on internal processes that enhance the risk management and strengths of the sustainability commitments. Therefore, it's obvious that there are possibilities where green bonds could possibly contribute towards an adaptation agenda and kind of move beyond the mitigation aspects that they usually tend to focus on. So yeah, that would be my answer.
Thank you. I'll to jump over to Olomide. Olomide, Africa is crying adaptation, and green bond seems to align different with mitigation. So, what is your take on it?
Um, okay, so let me say three things very quickly. Number one, yeah, not to be confused. Whilst if you're issuing a green bond, yeah, we've spoken about the use of proceeds. And the reason why Damilola said that it's often good for you to have a massive pipeline is because when someone like Gadget comes along and says, this doesn't meet the box, this doesn't meet the box, and you begin to reduce, you don't go below the threshold of the value. Yeah. That said, you don't necessarily have to repay the bond from the projects themselves. You can repay the bond from the company, but you must allocate the money to the projects, if that makes sense. So you must allocate the money you've raised to the projects, but the project itself does not necessarily have to repay the bonds. You can repay the bonds from your balance sheet if you like. For example, governments raise green bonds to do adaptation work. They don't make money from those projects, but they pay down the loan or the bond from taxes and other parts of whatever. In the same way, companies can do the same. So if I have if I wanted to say move from let's assume I was an energy company, right? And I currently use diesel to generate a lot of my power, but I want to move over to a more sustainable green type solar-based projects. I can borrow money, I can raise a debt, green bonds, to finance the implementation of or the production of that solar plant. Yeah, but I can pay down the loan from my existing business, which is not so green. What I cannot do is allocate that money to my existing business. If that makes sense. That's number one. Now, in terms of green bonds and adaptation and all that stuff, we actually did I was part of a research whilst I was in Glamour Bonds before we moved to CTL, where we wanted to see if there were any projects out there, any bonds out there that were specifically geared towards the issuance for adaptation. Now, we couldn't find any. That's not to say that there were no co-benefits from the ones that were issued. So with issued bonds, which had mitigation objectives, but also had adaptation co-benefits. It's a bit of a struggle to issue green bonds, especially in the private sector, for adaptation, because the type of projects that you would do, coastal erosion, providing water and all that kind of stuff, they're not ones that easily provide returns for private sector. So we don't have enough of that. There's loads of that we need in Africa because we need to adapt to climate change. And so a lot of the projects that we're looking to deal with in Africa, the diversification of Africa from the Sahara, the coastal erosions. We had issues with locusts recently with projects, farms in East Africa. We have issues with famine, all of that kind of stuff. The use of water, one of the things we're talking about in Africa, for instance, we have a water pool fund project in Kenya that we're trying to fund to provide water. Obviously, the PPPs that requires from government intervention. Now, the reason why you have more mitigation projects and adaptation is because it's a lot easier to draw up criteria and metrics that you can measure for mitigation. So, for instance, it's a lot easier to count the reduction in CO2 emission for energy projects or transportation, than it is if you're going to do some other projects that has to do with agriculture, so it will come. We will write more criteria. There will be more guidelines, and people like Daljit will help us understand what is required to meet that type of project. Once we have more information and more knowledge, then people will be able to identify those projects. They will put them forward. Daji will come along and his colleague, they will sign it off, and then we'll go and raise more money, and then we'll have more adaptation projects. But the reason why you have more mitigation is simply because it's a lot easier, and we always go for the low hanging fruits, first and foremost. But with more information, more education, we'll get there.
Oh, thank you for that. As speakers, because interest of time, and I think we've sort of touched on almost all the questions. As people will start giving our final remarks, maybe I'll give Damila the floor to basically conclude on this, give his perspective on this particular agenda, and also give his final remarks. Then we'd give it the floor to Divjit to sort of start giving his concluding remarks. Yes, so that because we can have another session on green bonds after that, because it seems a fairly complex, very interesting interesting topic. Yes, Damilola. I don't know if anyone had me. I was giving Damilola the floor. I don't know if he had my request to give the floor. If he has anything to contribute, as the speakers make the concluding remarks. Damilola. We can't hear you. Kindly unmute yourself.
Okay. So I would, sorry about that, I was on mute. So I would try to add a little bit to what Mr. Lala just mentioned in terms of mitigation projects being easier to track. And that's the reason is because, for example, if you were to track how much CO2 is being emitted from a bank, so that can be easily quantified and tracked in terms of migrating from diesel generator to gas generator. So if diesel generators were emitting so numbers of CO2, then if you mitigate that and then migrate to a gas generator, for example, or move to solar, you mitigated that. By totally moving from CO2 emission to non-CO2 emission. So that's what I want to add. And then also, I think for Africa, the best we can do is climate adaptation as well, because if you look at where Africa is today, a lot of us do not pay so much attention to climate change as they do in the West, and that's one of the things that set us back in Africa. Yeah, so I see climate adaptation being more realistic than mitigation, because if you look at a lot of Nigeria, for example, you have a lot of houses that rely on diesel generators. Nigerian banks, a lot of businesses, everyone works with diesel generator, and if you look at that, the impact of that is immense and does not help the economy. So at the end of the day, the best that we have to face in terms of reality is climate adaptation. So that's what I'll add as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. I'd give Divjit the floor to conclude, of course, basically, because I feel he's touched on a bit of an issue that I wanted to, it was basically the last question that was looking to touch into almost sort of a greenwashing or lack of a bit of, there's an issue that he touched on quite a bit there, not really in depth, but I think I'll give him the floor to give his final conclusion, remarks, basically how can, in addition to capacity building, how can young people basically strategize themselves to engage, even though not basically get issued green bonds, how could they engage, of course, within this green bond issues, maybe policy work or basically, yeah. So, Debjit, I'll give you the floor.
Sure, thank you very much. So I think the simplest answer to that would be microcredit, because if you look at uh, I would say from my education background that the last couple of Nobel Prizes in economics actually went to people who kind of like, significantly researched in this microcredit and green financing areas. And I would say that young people who kind of like significantly lack the resources to put their business ideas into like favorable outcomes and outputs. So microcredit, then setting up cooperatives or kind of like, getting loans from cooperatives would be an ideal approach for them to step into the world of like, green bonds and like finance. Because as Mr. Lala previously mentioned, that currently if you look at the market exposure of green bonds, it's essentially like, big corporates and like sovereigns and countries. So yeah, I think that staying up to date with the various rules and regulations that's being passed, and attending the latest COP delegations, and like, all these webinars would be like you like helpful for the young people to get engaging with green bonds. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that, Olumide. As you make your concluding remarks, what would you tell young people basically across the globe? Because you're now in Europe, especially Africans, and yeah, basically.
Well, without sounding, there's a phrase that says the youth are the future, yeah? So, when we all talk about this 2050, 2070, the people in power today making those decisions are not going to be alive. And if they are, they're not going to be so influential. You will be the ones running the countries. You will be the ones running the institutions, the banks. The question to ask is, how would you run these banks? How would you run the institutions? How would you run these governments if you don't have the knowledge and the expertise? So for me, it's education, education, education. Get educated, get interested, get passionate. Ask yourself the things you do on a daily basis. How does that impact not just the environment? How does it impact the climate? And everything goes in circles. How does it come back to bite you? So, you grab a bottle, you throw it on the streets. How does that end up in the gutters? How does that clog the place up? What is it you can do differently? You demand stuff. How can you reuse stuff rather than throw it away? How can you recycle stuff rather than throw it away? How do you turn waste into energy? So how can you, when you go to schools to become an architect, how do you study new architectural design so that you design your property such that it actually is more energy efficient, and that way you're using less energy to heat it up or cool it down. Yeah. The cars that you drive, for instance, can you cycle rather than drive? We need to think about what world do we need in the future and how do we fit into that. Get knowledgeable, get educated, figure out how you can add and contribute to that new world that we're all moving in. Then at that point, you begin to understand what sort of financing do you need to deliver that. Yeah. So it's one thing to understand what financing you need. It's one thing to understand what sort of world you want to live in. But then you have to ask yourself a question. The person to whom you're going for the financing, what does he need from you for you to get that financing? How do you make a project bankable? Bankability means how do you set up your project so that it's credit worthy? Because don't forget, it's still a debt, yeah? So the bank still needs to lend you money. So whoever is giving you, whether it's green, brown, or whatever, they need to know that your project will survive. Your project will make money. It's sustainable. That's number one. Secondly, what impact is it making? Well, you know what? If you don't even understand what green is, there's no point talking to Daljit because he's just going to scratch you off. Yeah? So you need to understand what Daljit needs to sign you off so that you can go to the man who's giving the green money so that Daljit you can safely say to that guy, well, I've gone to speak to Daljit. Daljit has signed me green. Give me the money. So yet again, it's education, education, education. I use the word education because that's what young people understand. We grown-ups, we understand capacity building, yeah? Because we're post-education. So we need more capacity. It's still the same thing. It's still education, yeah? So when I say capacity building, get interested. There is so much information online. One place I will send you to, my old organization called Climate Bonds Initiative. They've got loads of stuff on this green stuff online. I have a lot of colleagues who've moved to sustainability. People like me have gone off and set up my own company. We've got information on climate-transition.net that you can, blogs that we've put in there. Get passionate. Yeah. One thing I will say to us Africans, only we can change. Yeah. What it is we demand, only we can make it. Stop being passengers. Stop being onlookers. Demand of our leaders a better environment. Demand of our leaders more education. Demand of our leaders better health services. All of these things that make your life more sustainable, much better. You have to demand it. Yeah. Don't be a passenger. And you cannot make demands unless you have the knowledge. So, apology for being preaching, but look, at the end of the day, yeah, I was probably your age about 30 years ago. So, I look back and I ask myself, what sort of world will I want to live in 30 years' time? Well, it is you that can provide that world for me. So you ask of me what you want me to help you get to that world, and I will provide that for you. But you've got to ask first. And for you to ask, you've got to have the knowledge to ask the right questions. So the youth, the world of tomorrow belongs to the youth. So my final word to you is get educated.
Thank you. Very strong, powerful concluding remarks. Damilola? Damilola, concluding remarks, if you have any. If I don't know if Damilola is able to, yes.
Okay, I guess you called Damilola, even though I can't hear very clearly. But I think I would also agree to what Mr. Olumide Lala said in terms of training. And when he mentioned capacity building, that could also mean training. And the reason is because there are a lot of parties that play a part for a green bond to be issued and to eliminate climate change. The banks have a role to play, the commercial banks, development banks have a role to play, the SMEs, the project developers have their own role to play. So you cannot completely isolate any party or take any party out of the equation. And then, um, so it's even the bankers. I've worked with Nigerian banks where we try to organize and arrange loans that will be disbursed for SMEs. And one of the things I identified is that even the bankers do not clearly understand what green bond means. They do not understand the impact of climate change, and they do not appreciate it. So it's important for training. I know a lot of times in climate, in CFAO, Climate Finance Advice Limited, we try to arrange trainings for CEOs of banks, for the head of risk department, for the head of risk, and then for the essential key decision-making departments to help them to understand and appreciate green bonds and appreciate the value of financing and funding that industry. And that's one thing that is still ongoing at the moment. So it's important for us to keep learning, training ourselves, understanding the impact of climate change, understanding the role of banks, understanding the role of every party in the whole ecosystem. Because without that, we continue to experience gaps. And that's why Africa is still where we are right now, because we do not clearly understand the impact of climate change, and then we're not looking to progress from where we are right now. So training is important, understanding the elements and all the key enablers, the risk involved, and understanding clearly what needs to be done. So it's important that we clearly understand the role of every party, and then how we can make an impact, how we can change the ecosystem, and how we can change the world, starting from us as an individual. So that's what I would say. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for that. I don't know if Barry would like to make some concluding remarks as we close the session.
Sure, I would just like to
Okay,
add that,
Thank you.
Barry, let our speaker go first. Yes.
okay, cool.
okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for your
We
great
could
work.
let the speaker go first, and then you can
Okay,
continue
okay,
after Judy.
okay. Thank
Yes.
you.
Sure, I just wanted to add that like this has been a learning session not only for the youth but like for all the panelists present over here as well, given the diverse backgrounds we are all coming from. So I would like to thank the moderators to for organizing such a session, and I hope that like we have such engaging discussions and like webinars down the road ahead, and we would all be happy to contribute our knowledge and in turn learn from the other participants as well. Thank you very much for this lovely session this evening. Yeah.
Uh, yes, Olomide,
Barry,
before I
just
hand over to
to
Barry.
the
Yes,
organizers,
yes.
can I just say that there's a connection, obviously, between green bonds and green loans, especially when you're talking about SMEs. That might be a good session to talk about next time, how banks can provide green loans and what are the kind of things. So, you can't have the SMEs go directly to the green bonds, but there are green loans that come off the back of that. Perhaps we can talk about that next time. That would be an interesting one to look at.
Actually,
Just a
Lumid, I think
suggestion.
we'll send you a program for the calendar for the webinars, and you could possibly add that. It could be next week's session, basically, and we could discuss that. I think I will share with all of you, then we can brainstorm around it, because you seem to be expert, and I'm actually learning from you. So, yes, Barry, I don't know if you have something to conclude, something to say to the speakers.
Incidentally, I wrote a module for the Kenyan Banking Association on your sustainable finance initiative. That's actually online. It gives you background information on green bonds and who are the players and what does. I mean, if you send me an email, I can send that link to you and you can share with everybody. I don't think you need permission to go there, but that would be good background knowledge for people to learn. It's all online. I wrote that for the Kenya Banking Association for the bankers.
Okay, I will be sending you a lot of emails to Lumide and the rest of the speakers. This is
Happy to share. Happy to share.
expect them. Barry.
Okay, thank you very much for this.
Yes, and Barry is from Cameroon. Yes.
It was really great hearing from the different speakers and the different guests we have in the queue. For us, it's still the beginning, but we are trying to get into the system. And when we are sharing ideas as young like us, different ways on how to tackle the climate crisis globally from you people is really a plus for us because we know we are growing and we are trying to reach the target that the United Nations is giving us, living in what we call a green economy. That is less renewable and less.
Barry,
Uh, Barry is breaking off.
which part of Cameroon is Barry from?
I don't know if you can answer, Barry. I think he's having network issues. I don't know if Grace could step in as we wait for Barry to get online. Grace is from Tanzania, actually. Yes. Where the yes. Grace, I
Next
don't know if you
door.
have a bit of yes concluding remarks. Grace. Grace, are you able to hear me? I think there's a bit of technical issue. Grace, yes. Any final remarks, concluding remarks for speakers, Grace? Oh,
She's
okay.
on.
Barry,
She's on mute actually.
Grace is on mute.
unmute yourself. We can't hear you. Unmute.
I'm so sorry for the inconvenience, and the network is the problem, mostly in my area. But I think Dr. and some Smith have addressed everything concerning the webinar. And I hope that the next webinar I'll successfully contribute to every topic.
Okay, thank you, Grace. Thank you to speakers. Thank you for viewers for watching and listening. Kindly keep tuned and have a good evening, good morning, good night. And until next time, we'll have a session, a next session soon. Of course, we're going to have a session on green bonds and green loans. Yes, so thank you and goodbye to everyone. Bye bye.
Karibu.
Bye. Take care. Good
Thank you.
evening.
Asante sana. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.